The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Willow Creek, sending a flock of startled crows into the air as Ethan Sullivan clutched his side and stumbled toward the barn, each step a sharp reminder of the broken rib that threatened to pierce his lung. The year was 1875, and the Arizona Territory was as unforgiving as the men who'd ambushed him on the trail back from Tucson. Blood seeped through his fingers as he pushed open the weathered barn door, the familiar scent of hay and horsehide offering small comfort. His stallion, Thunderbolt, nickered softly in recognition, dark eyes watching as Ethan reached for the saddle hanging on the wall. He had to get to Doc Winters in town before nightfall, but lifting the heavy leather seat sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest. "Damn it all," he muttered, dropping to one knee, the saddle clattering to the ground beside him. The world spun for a moment, and he squeezed his eyes shut against the dizziness. "You shouldn't be moving around like that," came a firm voice from the doorway. Ethan's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt at his hip despite the agony it caused. A woman stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun, her skirts dusty from travel. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice strained. "And what are you doing on my property?" She stepped forward, unafraid, into a shaft of light that illuminated auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her traveling clothes were well-made but functional, marking her as neither poor nor particularly wealthy. "Grace Blackburn," she answered, setting down a small leather satchel. "I was on the stagecoach heading to Silver Springs when we saw smoke from your chimney. The driver mentioned no one lives out this far except a stubborn rancher named Sullivan." Her eyes flicked to the blood on his shirt. "Appears you could use some help," Ethan grimaced. "I don't need a woman's help, just need to get this saddle on and ride into town." Grace crossed the barn, took one look at his side, and shook her head. "With a broken rib, you'll puncture a lung before you make it halfway. How would you know about, my father was a doctor in Boston. I assisted him for years." She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly strong as she eased him back against a hay bale. "Let me see." Pride warred with practicality as pain clouded Ethan's judgment. Finally, he relented, allowing her to unbutton his shirt enough to examine the damage. "Broken, as I suspected," she confirmed, her touch professional but gentle. "And that's a bullet graze alongside it. You've been in quite a tussle, Mr. Sullivan." "Cattle rustlers," he explained through gritted teeth. "Caught them trying to drive off my herd." They didn't take kindly to my interruption. Grace reached for her satchel and withdrew a small medical kit. "Well, you're fortunate. The bullet only grazed you, but that rib needs binding before you go anywhere." "I need to get to town," Ethan insisted. "Those men will be back." "Then I'll take you," she said simply, beginning to clean his wound. "But first, let me bind this properly." Ethan watched her work with surprising efficiency, her fingers moving with practiced ease. What's a Boston doctor's daughter doing on a stagecoach to Silver Springs alone? A flicker of something pain perhaps crossed her face. "Starting fresh. My father passed last winter and there wasn't much left for me in Boston." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, finding he meant it. "Thank you." She finished cleaning the wound and began wrapping strips of clean cloth tightly around his torso. "I have a position waiting as schoolteacher in Silver Springs." Ethan couldn't help a small smile despite his pain. "Those ranch kids are going to get quite an education from a Boston lady." "I'm not as delicate as I might appear, Mr. Sullivan," she replied, tying off the bandage with a firm tug that made him wince. "Ethan," he corrected. "If you're going to doctor me up, you might as well use my Christian name." When she'd finished, Grace stood and walked to Thunderbolt, who eyed her warily. "This your horse?" "Yes, madam, name's Thunderbolt. Meanest, fastest stallion in the territory, and he doesn't take to strangers." Grace approached the horse slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. To Ethan's astonishment, the normally temperamental stallion allowed her to stroke his muzzle. "You have a way with difficult creatures," Ethan observed. Grace shot him a knowing look. "I've had practice." She reached for the fallen saddle, and though Ethan tried to protest, she expertly lifted it and placed it on Thunderbolt's back, securing it with practiced movements. "You've ridden before," he noted, impressed despite himself. "My uncle owned a farm outside Boston. I spent summers there as a girl." She adjusted the stirrups, then led Thunderbolt toward Ethan. "Can you stand?" With her help, Ethan got to his feet, pain shooting through his side. Getting onto the horse would be another matter entirely. "Wait here," Grace said, disappearing into the yard. She returned moments later leading a small wagon. "This will be easier on your ribs." "That's for hauling feed," Ethan protested. "It'll take twice as long to reach town." "And you'll arrive alive," she countered, hitching Thunderbolt to the wagon with surprising skill. "Now, are you going to argue with your doctor, or shall we get moving before those rustlers return?" Ethan sighed in defeat. "You always this bossy with your patients." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Only the stubborn ones." With Grace's help, Ethan settled into the wagon bed where she'd arranged hay into a makeshift cushion. She climbed onto the driver's seat and took the reins, clicking her tongue to set Thunderbolt in motion. "You sure you can handle him?" Ethan asked, concerned for both the woman and his prized horse. Grace glanced back, determination etched on her face. "Mr. Sullivan, I've handled far more difficult situations than an ornery stallion." As they pulled away from the ranch, Ethan watched the straight line of Grace's back, the confident way she handled the reins, and wondered what kind of woman abandoned Boston society for the harsh Arizona territory. Despite the pain in his side, he found himself increasingly curious about the mysterious Grace Blackburn. The journey to Willow Creek took nearly 2 hours, with Grace steering Thunderbolt at a pace that minimized the jarring for Ethan's injury. She proved adept at handling the horse, speaking to him occasionally in a low, soothing voice that seemed to calm the normally high-strung stallion. "You never did say how you learned to handle horses like that," Ethan remarked as they approached the outskirts of town. "My uncle bred carriage horses," Grace explained, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I was the only one who could handle the more spirited ones. He said I had a gift." A shadow passed over her face. "It was the only time anyone thought I had a gift for anything other than being a proper society lady." The bitterness in her tone made Ethan curious. "Is that why you left? To escape being proper?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "I left because after my father died, my cousin Herbert, who inherited everything, made it clear that my options were to marry his business associate, a man 3 times my age, or become destitute." "So you chose door number 3, Ethan observed. A small smile touched her lips. "Precisely. The school teacher position came through a friend of my father's. It offered escape and purpose." They rolled into Willow Creek as the afternoon sun cast long shadows down the dusty Main Street. The small frontier town consisted of one main thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, hotel, and at the far end, a small building with a weathered sign reading Dr. J. Winters, physician. Grace pulled the wagon directly to the doctor's office. Inside, they found a gray-haired man cleaning instruments who looked up in surprise. "Ethan Sullivan," the doctor said, frowning. "What trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" "Broken rib and bullet graze," Grace answered before Ethan could speak. "I've cleaned and bound the wound, but he'll need proper medical attention." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow, looking from Grace to Ethan. "And you are Grace Blackburn," she replied, helping Ethan onto the examination table. "My father was Dr. Thomas Blackburn of Boston. I assisted in his practice." Recognition dawned on the doctor's face. "Thomas Blackburn? I studied some of his papers on battlefield medicine after the war. Brilliant man." He examined Grace's handiwork with an approving nod. "And it appears his daughter inherited his skills. This is excellent field dressing." While the doctor examined him more thoroughly, Ethan watched Grace move around the office, immediately at home among the medical supplies, helping the doctor in silent efficiency. "The binding will need to stay on for at least 4 weeks, doctor." Winters instructed after confirming Grace's diagnosis. And you'll need actual rest, Ethan, not your usual idea of taking it easy, which means still breaking horses and chasing rustlers. I can't afford 4 weeks of sitting around, Ethan protested. I've got a ranch to run. Then hire help, the doctor said firmly. Or end up with a punctured lung, your choice. Grace, who had been quietly organizing instruments, spoke up. The stagecoach to Silver Springs doesn't leave until tomorrow. I could stay and help for the night, make sure he doesn't do anything foolish. Both men turned to stare at her. That wouldn't be proper, Miss Blackburn, Dr. Winters said carefully. What's not proper is letting a patient injure himself further because of stubbornness, she replied evenly. Besides, I'm a physician's daughter. Consider it professional assistance. Ethan found himself oddly touched by her concern. My foreman's wife could act as chaperone if propriety's the worry. She comes by daily to cook and clean. Dr. Winters sighed. Very well, but Ethan, I mean it complete rest. And Miss Blackburn, the stagecoach leaves at noon tomorrow. Don't miss it, they only come through once a week. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Miller burst into the office, his weathered face grave. Ethan, we've got trouble. Those rustlers you reported. They hit the Johnson place last night, took half his herd and burned his barn. Word is they're working their way through the valley. Ethan straightened despite the pain. Have you formed a posse? That's why I'm here. We're heading out at dawn. Count me in, Ethan said automatically. Like hell, Dr. Winters interjected. Did you not hear a word I said about that rib? The sheriff looked at Ethan's bandaged torso and shook his head. Doc's right, you'd be a liability in this condition. My ranch could be next, Ethan argued. I'll send 2 of my deputies to watch your place, Sheriff Miller promised, but you stay put and heal up. After the sheriff left, Grace helped Ethan back to the wagon. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the town. We should get supplies before heading back, Grace suggested. I noticed your pantry was nearly empty, Mrs. Cooper, my foreman's wife, usually handles that, Ethan said, but Grace was already steering them toward the general store. Inside, the proprietor greeted Ethan warmly. Sullivan, heard you had a run-in with those rustlers. You all right? I'll live, Ethan replied, easing himself onto a bench while Grace efficiently gathered supplies. The storekeeper watched her with curious eyes. Don't believe I've had the pleasure, Miss Grace Blackburn, she replied with a polite smile. I'm just passing through, helping Mr. Sullivan until I catch tomorrow's stagecoach to Silver Springs. Silver Springs, eh? That's Mason territory. They've had their share of troubles with those same rustlers. Grace paused in her shopping. Is the town not safe? The storekeeper waved a hand. Safe enough, I suppose, but isolated. School's been without a teacher for months since the last one fled after the raid. Ethan watched concern flicker across Grace's face. Raid? She asked quietly. Just a small one, the man assured her. But enough to frighten off city folk. On the ride back to the ranch, Grace was uncharacteristically quiet. Ethan, despite his pain, found himself wanting to ease her worry. Silver Springs isn't as bad as Jenkins made it sound, he offered. They've had trouble, but what frontier town hasn't? Grace nodded, but her eyes remained troubled. I just didn't expect. I suppose I was naive to think I was leaving danger behind in Boston. Different kinds of danger out here, Ethan acknowledged, but different freedoms too, she glanced at him. Is that why you came west, for freedom? Ethan considered the question. Partly. After the war, there wasn't much left for me back east. My parents died in a fire while I was fighting, came home to nothing. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. It was a long time ago, he replied, though the pain had never fully faded. The war changed everything anyway. I couldn't go back to being the person I was before. I understand that feeling, Grace murmured, her eyes on the darkening horizon. They reached the ranch as the first stars appeared. Mrs. Cooper, the foreman's wife, had left a pot of stew warming on the stove, but there was no sign of her or anyone else. She must have left early with the threat of rustlers, Ethan said, easing himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Grace lit lamps around the small but tidy ranch house. I'll prepare a place for myself on the sofa, Grace said, serving them both bowls of the hearty stew. Take the bedroom, Ethan insisted. I'll be fine out here. It's easier than trying to climb those stairs anyway. Grace looked like she might argue, then nodded. Thank you. They ate in companionable silence, both exhausted from the day's events. When they'd finished, Grace cleared the dishes despite Ethan's protests. You should rest, she told him firmly. Been resting all day in that wagon, he grumbled, but allowed her to help him to the sofa where she arranged pillows to support his injured side. Grace checked his bandages one last time, her touch gentle but professional. The binding is holding well. How's the pain? Manageable, Ethan lied, not wanting to admit how much it actually hurt. Grace gave him a knowing look. There's laudanum in my medical kit if you need it. I don't take to that stuff, he said. Makes my head foggy. Stubborn, she muttered, but with a hint of a smile. Very well. Call if you need anything in the night. Left alone in the darkened living room, Ethan found himself thinking about Grace Blackburn. There was something refreshing about her directness, her competence. Most women he'd known since coming west fell into two categories. The hardened frontier wives who'd seen too much suffering to maintain softness, or the delicate Eastern transplants who quickly withered under the harsh realities of territorial life. Grace seemed to be something else entirely refined yet resilient, gentle yet strong. He wondered what her life had been like in Boston, what she'd left behind besides an unwanted suitor and painful memories. Sometime in the night, pain drove him from restless sleep. The fire had died down, leaving the room cold. Ethan struggled to sit up, his broken ribs sending sharp protests through his body. Here, came Grace's voice from the darkness. She moved to the fireplace, adding wood and stirring the embers until flames caught. In the growing light, Ethan saw she wore a simple white nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her auburn hair loose down her back. Didn't mean to wake you, he said, his voice rough. You didn't. I couldn't sleep. She brought him a cup of water. The pain's worse at night. Speaking from experience, he asked. A shadow crossed her face. Yes. The simple answer contained volumes, making Ethan wonder what injuries, physical or otherwise, she had endured. Grace sat in the armchair across from him, tucking her feet beneath her. The firelight caught in her hair, turning it to liquid copper. Tell me about your ranch, she said. How did you come to settle here? Grateful for the distraction from his pain, Ethan found himself talking about his arrival in the Arizona Territory 7 years earlier. How he'd worked as a hired hand until he saved enough to buy his own small plot, which he'd gradually expanded into the modest but successful ranch it was now. It's not much compared to the big spreads, he admitted, but it's mine, built everything with these 2 hands. It's impressive, Grace said, and he could tell she meant it, to create something from nothing that takes remarkable courage. What about you? He asked. Was teaching always your ambition? Grace smiled sadly. No, I wanted to follow my father into medicine, but she trailed off, staring into the fire. Women doctors aren't exactly welcomed, even in progressive Boston. Seems a waste, Ethan observed. You've clearly got the knowledge and skill. That's kind of you to say, she replied, surprise evident in her voice. Most men think women too emotional for medical practice. Ethan snorted. I've seen men fall apart at the sight of blood while women calmly birth babies and tend horrific injuries. That argument never held water with me. Grace studied him with new interest. You're not what I expected, Ethan Sullivan. Is that good or bad? He asked with a half smile. Good, she said softly. Definitely good. They talked until the fire burned low again, sharing pieces of their lives, finding unexpected common ground despite their different backgrounds. When Grace finally returned to the bedroom, Ethan found his pain had receded to a dull ache, overshadowed by a different sensation altogether, one he hadn't felt in years. Morning brought a burst of activity. Ethan awoke to find Grace already dressed and cooking breakfast, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the small house. You didn't have to do all this, he said, carefully sitting up. I wanted to, she replied, setting a plate before him. Besides, it may be my last chance to cook in a proper kitchen for some time. I suspect Silver Springs accommodations will be rather basic. The mention of her departure cast a shadow over the meal. Ethan found himself searching for reasons to delay her journey, even as he knew it was selfish. The stagecoach doesn't leave until noon, he reminded her. No rush. Grace seemed about to respond when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, Ethan spotted 3 riders approaching, none of whom he recognized. "Get my rifle," he said quietly, rising despite the pain. "It's beside the door." Grace moved quickly, bringing him the Winchester without question. "Rustlers? Maybe." Ethan checked that the rifle was loaded. "Stay inside, away from the windows." Instead, Grace fetched the pistol from his holster, checking it with practiced ease. At his surprised look, she explained, "My father believed in being prepared. Boston wasn't always safe either." The riders pulled up outside and a voice called out, "Hello, the house." Ethan moved to the door, rifle ready but not raised. "State your business," names Marshall from Silver Springs. "Looking for Miss Blackburn. Stagecoach Company said she might be here." Ethan glanced at Grace, who had moved beside him, pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. "You know them?" "No," she whispered. "What's your business with Miss Blackburn?" Ethan called back, "School board business. Urgent matter." After a moment's hesitation, Grace stepped forward. "I'm Grace Blackburn." The lead rider, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, removed his hat. "Madam." "Jeremiah Marshall, head of the Silver Springs School Board. We received word you were delayed here. Thought we'd escort you the rest of the way, considering the trouble with rustlers lately." "That's very kind," Grace replied cautiously, "but I was planning to take the stagecoach at noon." "Afraid there's been a change," Marshall said. "Stagecoach won't be running today. Bridge washed out after yesterday's rain upstream." Ethan kept his rifle ready. Something felt off. "Mighty coincidental you 3 happened to be in Willow Creek just as the stage was canceled." Marshall's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We came specifically because of that. Got word by telegraph last night." Before Ethan could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the other direction. Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies galloped into the yard, rifles drawn. "Drop your weapons, all of you." The sheriff commanded. "Ethan, Grace, get inside." Confusion erupted as Marshall and his companions reached for their guns, only to find themselves outgunned and surrounded. Within moments, the 3 men were disarmed and dismounted. "What's going on, Sheriff?" Ethan demanded from the doorway. "These aren't from Silver Springs," Miller explained, keeping his rifle trained on the captives. "Telegraph came through last night. The real Jeremiah Marshall was found dead 2 days ago. These are part of the Rustler gang using his name." Grace gasped softly beside Ethan. "But how did they know about me?" "Small towns, big ears," the sheriff said grimly. "They've been kidnapping women traveling alone, selling them across the border. Been happening all through the territory." Ethan felt cold rage sweep through him at the thought of what might have happened if the sheriff hadn't arrived. His arm moved instinctively around Grace's shoulders. As the deputies secured the prisoners, Sheriff Miller approached the house. "Miss Blackburn, I'm afraid the part about the stagecoach is true. The bridge to Silver Springs did wash out in the storm. It'll be at least a week before passage is safe." Grace's face fell. "What am I to do? I was expected at the school." "I've sent word explaining the delay," the sheriff assured her. "But you'll need lodging until then." "She can stay here," Ethan said immediately, then added, "Mrs. Cooper can chaperone, of course." Grace looked at him in surprise. "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," Ethan insisted. "Besides, I still need that proper medical attention Doc Winters prescribed." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Seems a sensible arrangement. I'll have Mrs. Cooper move in temporarily." He tipped his hat. "Miss Blackburn, sorry for the scare. We've been tracking this gang for months." After the sheriff departed with his prisoners, Grace and Ethan stood in awkward silence on the porch, watching the dust settle on the trail. "You don't have to let me stay," Grace said finally. "I'm sure there are rooms at the hotel in town. Do Do you want to stay?" Ethan asked directly, turning to face her. Grace met his gaze, something vulnerable in her eyes. Yes, I think I do." "Then it's settled," he said simply. The next few days established a rhythm between them, with Mrs. Cooper installed in the spare room as chaperone and propriety guardian. Grace took over Ethan's care in earnest. Under her watchful eye, he begrudgingly followed Dr. Winter's instructions, though he chafed at the inactivity. To keep him from growing too restless, Grace enlisted his help with other tasks, teaching her about ranch operations, explaining the territory's history, even helping her prepare lesson plans for her eventual arrival in Silver Springs. Each evening after Mrs. Cooper retired early, the woman had a gift for tactful absence. They would sit before the fire and talk for hours. Ethan found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about the war, his struggles afterward, his dreams for the future. Grace, in turn, revealed more about her life in Boston, her difficult relationship with her mother, and her thwarted medical ambitions. "Have you never considered marrying?" Grace asked on the third evening, their conversation having turned to family. Ethan stared into the fire. "Once. Before the war. Elizabeth Carter, daughter of my father's business partner, we were practically betrothed." "What happened?" "She married a banker while I was fighting at Gettysburg," he said without bitterness. "Can't blame her. We all thought the war would be over in months, not years." "Did you love her?" Grace asked softly. Ethan considered the question. "I thought I did. Now I'm not so sure. We were young and it was what both families wanted." He glanced at Grace. "What about you? Besides the ancient suitor your cousin selected," Grace smiled ruefully. "There was someone. A doctor who worked with my father, I thought. But he couldn't see past my gender, wanted a wife, not a colleague." "His loss," Ethan said simply. Their eyes met across the space between them, and something electric passed between them: recognition, possibility, desire. Grace looked away first, a blush coloring her cheeks. As the week progressed, Ethan's physical condition improved, though he still moved carefully to protect his healing rib. Grace's presence had transformed the ranch house, not just with feminine touches, but with laughter and conversation that filled spaces Ethan hadn't realized were empty. On the fifth day, Grace accompanied Ethan on a slow walk to check on a newborn calf in the nearest pasture. The spring air was crisp but warming, wildflowers beginning to dot the grasslands. "It's beautiful here," Grace observed, her face tilted toward the sun. "Different from New England, but beautiful in its own way." "You sound like you could grow to love it," Ethan said carefully. Grace glanced at him. "Perhaps I already do." They stopped at the fence line, watching the calf wobble around its mother. In comfortable silence, they leaned against the weathered wood, shoulders barely touching. "The bridge should be passable by tomorrow," Ethan said finally, the words coming reluctantly. Grace nodded, eyes still on the calf. "Yes, Sheriff Miller mentioned that yesterday. Silver Springs will be getting their schoolteacher at last." "Yes," she agreed, her voice quiet. Ethan turned to face her, gathering his courage. "Unless." Grace looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Unless you decided to stay," he finished. "In Willow Creek." "And what would I do in Willow Creek?" she asked, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed her emotion. "They already have a teacher." "They need a doctor," Ethan said. "Doc Winters has been talking about retiring for years. He could train you, make it official." Hope flickered across Grace's face, quickly replaced by doubt. The town would never accept a woman doctor. "They might if she were married to a respected rancher," Ethan said, taking her hand. "If that's something she might consider." Grace's eyes widened. "Ethan, I know it's sudden," he continued quickly. "And maybe I'm a fool for asking when we've known each other barely a week. But Grace, I feel like I've known you all my life. When you took those reins that first day, something changed for me." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes. "For me too." "I'm not offering a grand Boston mansion or high society," Ethan said. "Just a modest ranch, a man who'd cherish you, and the chance to be the doctor you were meant to be. You'd support that, truly?" Grace asked, searching his face. "Most men would expect their wives to give up such ambitions." "I'm not most men," Ethan replied. "And you're certainly not most women, Grace Blackburn." A tear slipped down her cheek as she smiled. "No, you certainly aren't." "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked, hardly daring to hope. Instead of answering, Grace closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that spoke volumes. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she whispered, "Yes, Ethan Sullivan. That's a yes." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Grace Sullivan stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching her husband work with a new colt in the corral. His broken rib had healed completely, leaving only a slight tenderness in damp weather. The past months had brought many changes to Willow Creek. Doc Winters had enthusiastically taken Grace as his apprentice, telling anyone who would listen that Thomas Blackburn's daughter had inherited her father's medical genius. Initially skeptical, the townspeople had gradually accepted Grace after she successfully delivered twins during a complicated birth and saved a ranch hand's arm that another doctor would have amputated. The small office beside their home now bore a sign reading, "Doctor Grace Sullivan, physician, with office hours 3 days a week." The other days, she assisted Ethan with the ranch, which had prospered under their joint care. Ethan finished with the colt and walked toward the house, his stride confident, face breaking into a smile when he saw her waiting. "How are my two favorite people this morning?" he asked, placing a hand gently on Grace's slightly rounded stomach. "We're both well," she replied, covering his hand with hers. "Though your son or daughter seems determined to make me crave Mrs. Cooper's apple pie at all hours." Ethan laughed, pulling her close. "Then we'll have to make sure there's always pie." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had made, Grace thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought her here, how a broken rib, a saddled horse, and a woman taking the reins had changed the course of 2 lives forever. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. "About Silver Springs, the school." Grace shook her head, looking out over the land that had become home. "Not one," she said truthfully. "This is where I was meant to be, where we both were meant to be." Ethan kissed her forehead tenderly. "I knew it that first day, when you took those reins like you'd been handling Thunderbolt all your life. Some things are just meant to be." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting the ranch in golden light, Grace leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful for the broken rib that had brought them together, and for the courage they'd both found to forge a new path, one they would walk side by side for all their days.